Through the years that followed the pioneer expansion, quilts were made for our soldiers during Civil War. Quilts also became album quilts, friendship quilts, where you would make a quilt full of one block only and have a spot for your friends to sign. Quilts that had a center medallion were very popular, but most quilts were utilitarian. There was a fad that came from England called crazy quilts. Now these quilts were made out of velvets and satins, pieces of suits and ribbons, and as you laid these pieces next to each other and opened up the seams, you could fill those seams with very, very fancy embroidery. Many of these quilt tops were not quilted completely through, but remained only a top and were used as a guest bed coverlet. This is why there are so many of them still available today and can be seen in museums all over the country. Many of the fabrics that our grandparents used to make their quilts came from feed sacks. This is where the feed companies would package up feed and flour and sugar and such in sacks that were made of fabric. The one hazard was, though, that the farmer, when he went to town to buy supplies, his wife would always remind him, be sure, check the patterns on the feed sack so that I can have several of the same design and have enough fabric to make a dress. Many of the quilts that you have in your closets, probably inherited from your grandmother, used these fabrics. They are also being reproduced nowadays so that you can recreate those same quilts with new fabrics. The invention of the sewing machine in 1856 began to change the quilting world. More and more quilts were machine-pieced, and this is a trend that we still see today. Many people think that a quilt is only a quilt if it is traditionally pieced by hand and quilted by hand. I am of the firm belief, however, that had a pioneer woman had a sewing machine, she would have used it. After the Depression years, quilting faded onto the back burner as we fought World War II. But an interest in quilting began to be revived again for America's bicentennial celebration. That, coupled with one new invention. In 1979, a Japanese garment maker created a brand new tool that has revolutionized garment making and quilting. This tool is called a rotary cutter. It is a circular razor blade which slices through fabric just like a pizza cutter. Before the rotary cutter was created, any designs and patterns had to be traced out on a piece of cardboard, laid on your fabric, traced with a pencil, and cut out by hand with a pair of scissors. This, however, has changed the entire quilting world because when you combine a self-healing mat, a ruler, and the rotary cutter, you can cut many layers of fabric at a time, accurately and quickly. In today's world, there's room for everyone in quilting. Quilting ranges all the way from traditional quilts to art quilts. Most traditional quilters will go back into the historical patterns and use reproduction fabrics to recapture quilts with the feeling of the Civil War or of the 1930s. But the opposite end of the spectrum are art quilters who make smaller pieces to be used as art on the wall. Often these art quilters are not afraid to manipulate and change their fabrics. They will paint them, they will stamp them, they will burn them, they will shred the fabric, they will dye them different colors, and then when they're all put together they will embellish their quilts very often with beads, shells, or anything else they can find in the hardware store that helps them to get their point across for their art statement. The quilts that most people do nowadays, and myself included, is that we find ourselves in between traditional and art quilters in a world that is called contemporary quilting. Our techniques and some of our designs are based in traditional quilting, and we might be artistic in our choice of fabrics, color, and design. But our entire focus is having fun with the new fabrics of today that are brighter and bolder in color, and tweaking traditional patterns and designs to make them have a more geometric feel. You might be interested in quilting. There are many resources available to you, including local guilds and quilt shops. You can check the internet and find all sorts of organizations that would be willing to help you on your quilting journey. Thank you for visiting today, and happy quilting!